Another statement that the Impressionists will make is that the English didn't educate the Indian population much, and to the extent they did, well, I'll let Tharoor present the basic argument here.
You take language, for example. The British had no intention of imparting education to the masses of Indians and made it very clear they weren't going to spend the money doing that. The fact is that the British were not interested in investing in education, and even the English language was brought in just to educate a narrow class of sort of interpreters between the governors and the governed, people who would help the British by constituting a buffer between them and the dirty masses whom they ruled. We need to create a class of Indians, Indian in skin and color, but English in opinions and tastes and morals and in intellect. And it was to serve their purposes.
Guess what, guys? This is literally not true. In terms of how education funds were spent in India, it was over 90% on primary schooling. The goal was to educate the masses, if we to our infer motive from what the money was actually being spent on. It was actually being spent on primary schooling. Literally the exact opposite of what Tharoor here said. The proportion of government spending spent on education wasn't much lower than Western European countries, and consider the results. Literacy in India went from around 3.25% to around 17.88%, so a 5.5-fold increase. And the princely states weren't spending that much on education before the Raj, before the English took over. But these breathless condemnations, or the claim that the British only funded higher level education because they wanted to create an administrative buffer out of the Indian elite educated in English ways, well, their actions don't point to this at all. Their actions point to an intent to engage in mass education and to improve literacy. Now, Tharoor attacks the English for spending most of the education budget on higher level education and not primary education. And we know this is false, but that's his argument. But what if Tharoor believed, as coincidentally happens to be the case, what if he believed that the English spent more on primary education than on higher level education? What would Tharoor's narrative be then? Well, if that were the case, I think Tharoor would argue that the English were only funding lower primary basic education because they didn't view the Indians as being capable of higher level reasoning, and thus not worth anything beyond a basic education, those racist Englishmen, and that it was more useful to have an Indian population that was basically literate and basically numerate, but they didn't want them to become too educated lest they get uppity or lest they start competing with the English economy itself. That would sort of be Tharoor's spin if Tharoor believed that the English were spending more on primary or basic education than on higher education. See, if the English focus the education funds on higher education, well, that means they're not interested in educating the masses in India, but are more interested in setting up a bureaucratic elite, right? Those racists, they don't care about the Indians, they're just using education of the elite Indians as a way to control the masses. But if they were to focus more on basic education than on higher education, well, then what they're doing is they're depriving Indians of more advanced education because the English are racists who don't think the Indians are either worthy of such education or don't want them to become too educated and too skillful lest they become economically competitive with industrial Britain. Tharoor was able to find plenty of anecdotes and plenty of little quotes pointing to this false notion that the Raj spent more on higher than primary education. Right, so this is also sort of an object lesson in how worthless these little trinket anecdotes and these little quotes, this bullshit history, are actually getting at the truth.
Donkey Desi, American professor. Jai Hind, and God bless America.